Welcome back to a little bit of philosophy. This is Philosophy 101, Unit 4, Lecture 5, Immanuel Kant and Deontological Ethics. In our last video, we explored the teleological branch of normative ethics with an emphasis on Jeremy Bentham's version of utilitarianism. What makes all three consequentialist theories similar is that they hold that moral obligation is defined as achieving the best consequences from our actions, which is defined either as pleasure or happiness. But of course, as we noted previously, clearly distinguishing between the concepts of pleasure and happiness can be a little tricky, and many philosophers have used the terms almost interchangeably. Thus, it might be argued that moral egoism and hedonism are really just the same thing. What distinguishes utilitarianism from the other two is its insistence that the greatest happiness or pleasure should be sought for the greatest number of people, not just for the individual moral agent. In this video, we'll turn to the deontological branch of normative ethics. Theories that fall under this heading all reject the idea that moral obligation is determined by the consequences of our actions. Instead, deontological theories locate moral obligation either in some intrinsic feature of the action or the will of the moral agent. There are many different moral theories that fall under this heading, but existentialism, Stoicism, Kantianism, and the divine command theory are among the more popular deontological types. The divine command theory holds that moral obligation is derived from the fact that God has given a command, while existentialism holds that moral obligation is created through our radically free choices. Alternatively, Stoicism locates moral obligation in the cosmic logos, or rational structure of the universe. All these theories are fascinating and deserve a video of their own, but today we'll be focusing on the moral theory of Immanuel Kant, conveniently known simply as Kantianism. Now, Immanuel Kant is the founder of a philosophical movement known as German idealism, which was popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, which, at heart, sought to distinguish our knowledge of things in themselves versus how things appear to us to be. The movement grows out of Kant's attempt to synthesize the two major competing epistemological theories of the modern period, rationalism and empiricism. As we explored in our videos on the subject of epistemology, the early modern or Enlightenment period was in large part shaped by the desire to respond to the intellectual chaos and skepticism that grew out of the radical social and intellectual transformations of the Renaissance. The Cartesian school held that knowledge was dependent on the existence of certain innate cognitions that form a secure foundation of a priori ideas, which could be used to justify our a posteriori ideas arising from sensory experience. On the other hand, the empirical tradition arising from the works of John Locke, and expanded on later by David Hume, held that there were no innate ideas, and that all knowledge that we would ever be able to attain must be based on direct sensory perception, or the relationships that exist between the ideas that we derive from direct sensory experience. Now, in our last video, we saw that the utilitarian moral theory of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill was a direct response to the growing influence of the empirical theory of knowledge. Immanuel Kant, a contemporary of Bentham, would develop an alternative moral theory, which arose from his attempt to find a middle ground between the rationalist and empirical approaches to knowledge. Now, Kant agreed with the empiricists' rejection of innate ideas, but he was horrified by Hume's argument that empiricism would inevitably lead to skepticism regarding sensory observations. In other words, there's no such thing as scientific knowledge. His solution was to argue that while there were no innate ideas, there were innate categories which formed the structure of any rational mind. So for Kant, the mind is not passively receiving ideas from external objects, but rather our sense data is being processed or organized by the innate categories of the mind creating what he called judgments, or thoughts. Of course, this still leaves a gap between how things actually are in the world and how we understand them to be, but Kant argued that the objective nature of the categories of the mind meant that knowledge was possible, including moral knowledge. Kant's theory of knowledge is going to shape his entire moral theory. For example, when we examine our moral judgments, our moral thoughts, we find that they are centered in our understanding that obligation, or oughtness, is really nothing other than the recognition of a law of pure practical reason. Given that obligation arises from a rational law, it follows that it must be universal in its scope. It must be equally binding on any being capable of conceiving an obligation. This is what we learned earlier as the universalizability criterion of an acceptable moral principle, which is the central point moral objectivists make in arguing against relativism. If moral obligations are relative, then they can't be equally binding on all moral agents, only those who are part of the group to whom the moral principle is relative. Imagine that you had two groups of people, and one asserted that 2 plus 2 equals 4, while the other asserted that 2 plus 2 is 5. If the rules of reason were relative, then they might both be right. But if the rules of reason are objective, then one of these groups has to be wrong. Kant's argument is that since morality, like arithmetic, is derived from the rules of reason, then the rules of morality will be universal as well. Now, the difference between arithmetic and morality for Kant is that the former is derived from pure reason and the latter from practical reason, which just means that it involves choice. That means that the will of the moral agent is essential in acting on what reason demands. We could know what reason tells us is good, but we still have to act upon it. We have to bring our will to act in line with the dictates of reason. If our will aligns with the good, it can be described as a good will. And for Kant, this is the only thing that can be properly described as good in itself. It's not good because it's aimed at achieving some end or attaining something else. It is good solely because it is aligned with the dictates of reason. Or as he puts it, a good will is good not because of what it performs or what it affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply in virtue of the volition. This is precisely where teleological theories fail, according to Kant. Egoists, hedonists, even utilitarians are attempting to will some particular consequence, be it pleasure or happiness for the greatest number. But he argues this doesn't match up with what we discover about the world. Instead, he argues that when we examine the structure of nature, we discover it contains perfect adaptations to ends. So if happiness was what nature had intended for us, it would have provided us with an instinctive guide to happiness. But what nature has given us is practical reason to guide our will, not instinctive behavior aimed at happiness. And the dictates of practical reason don't always make us happy. Thus, we are designed to be rational agents, not happiness-seeking agents. That, of course, doesn't make happiness or pleasure bad. It just means that those ends, those consequences, are not what we are designed to seek by nature. Now, with this in mind, Kant identifies three basic moral propositions. First, rightness is determined by our recognition of an obligation to act in a certain way. That is, we feel the sting of oughtness because we have a duty to do something. Second, the rightness of the obligation is derived from the principle of practical reason that gives that obligation. In other words, the obligation arises from our awareness of the principle that is part of the rational structure of our mind. So we can understand the idea of duty or obligation as the motivation we feel to obey the laws of reason, and in the case of morality, the laws of practical reason. Again, to use the example of arithmetic, when I'm confronted with the question, what's the solution to 2 plus 2? Reason tells me that the answer is 4. Of course, I'm free to answer 5, or square, or even fish if I want to, but to do so would be to act contrary to what I know is the correct answer. The same is true in the realm of practical reason. When I ask, what should I do? The answer already lies in the very structure of my rational mind. The answer is contained in the categorical imperative. Now, the word imperative is just a fancy philosophical word for command. So Kant is saying that when it comes to action, practical reason, which is part of the structure of our mind, tells us what we ought to do. If I'm hungry, it tells me to eat. If I'm tired, it tells me to sleep. But these commands are not good in themselves. They're good for the sake of something else. They would be examples of what he calls hypothetical commands, commands that are aimed at achieving something other than themselves, some end. If I'm hungry, I should eat. If I'm tired, I should sleep. But when it comes to my interaction with other rational beings, reason gives us an absolute command, a categorical imperative. It is not good because it secures some end like happiness or pleasure. It is something good in itself. Now, when we think about the categorical command of practical reason, we find that it contains 3 distinct formulations, or has at least 3 different dimensions. The first tells us what kind of principle we should choose to follow regarding our interactions with other rational agents. This first formulation of the categorical imperative tells us that the principle we should choose to follow is one that we would want everyone else to choose to follow as well. Since all moral agents are rational agents alike, we should only adhere to a principle that would be equally binding on all of us. And what is it that reason tells us that such a principle would be? It tells us that we should always act toward other rational agents as if they were an end in themselves, not means by which we can achieve some other end. Persons, that is, beings with a rational mind, are not objects, they're not tools, they're not instruments. They are intrinsically valuable and therefore worthy of respect equal to oneself. But why? What makes a rational agent intrinsically valuable? The answer lies in the third dimension of the categorical imperative. Because in every rational agent, there is a will that has the ability to order its actions as if it were the universal lawmaker. The intrinsic value of a rational being lies in their autonomy, their ability to act in accordance with the dictates of reason. Of course, as Kant makes clear, just because we have the capacity to act according to the dictates of reason doesn't mean that we will do so. We very often act heteronomously. That is, we allow ourselves to be controlled in ways that are beyond our direct will. We allow ourselves to be ruled by others. That's what heteronomy, the opposite of autonomy, means. But this fact that we often act heteronomously is not a defect of reason. It's a defect of our will to do that which we, as rational agents, know we ought to do. Now, the consequences of Kant's moral theory can be a little startling to our common feelings about social interaction. If someone asks me how I feel about their new hat, the categorical imperative tells me that I ought to tell the truth. Being honest might be a breach of etiquette, but since they are a rational agent, I should never lie to them. To do so would be to violate their autonomy, to treat them not as an end in themselves, but rather as a means to some other end. Now, of course, the categorical imperative doesn't compel me to answer, but if I choose to answer, it should be truthful. Even more startling is the case of the potential murderer, who demands to know where you're hiding someone that they intend to kill. Even the person threatening murder is a rational agent, even though they aren't necessarily acting according to the categorical imperative. But that doesn't change the fact that you're forbidden to lie. Now, you can refuse to answer, or you could attempt to constrain the murderer, or you could reason with them about why they're acting irrationally, but you cannot lie to them, because doing so would be to treat them as a means to an end. Now, the case of lying is just one example of how the categorical imperative is an absolute command of practical reason. Similar outcomes would follow from any interaction between rational agents. The categorical imperative commands us to always treat other rational agents, including ourselves, as ends in themselves, never as a means to some other end. There is so much more we could say about Kant's moral theory, but as always, we're limited by time. Suffice it to say that this approach to morality is clearly deontological, since the consequences of our actions are irrelevant in determining what we ought to do. Further, Kant's theory is a consequence of his epistemological project to find some middle ground between empiricism and rationalism. The Kantian synthesis, known as transcendental idealism, leads us to recognize that only a person who always chooses according to reason can be considered good in themselves. Since practical reason is the only proper guide to the will, and since it forms the structure of the rational mind, morality for Kant will be both objective and absolute. And finally, what practical reason dictates is the categorical imperative, which tells us that we should always choose a moral principle that is universalizable, that we should always treat rational agents, including ourselves, as ends and never as tools or instruments to achieve some other end, and that the reason that rational agents are intrinsically valuable is that by nature, all rational agents have the ability to act autonomously. Next to utilitarianism, Kantianism is the most influential moral theory to develop in the modern period, and its influence continues down to the present in the great debate in normative ethics. That's all for now. Be sure to come back again as we continue to explore a little bit of philosophy.